Right, thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to pick up on several of the points that have been made by the previous speakers, particularly Benjamin Sporton. And I want to focus very much in on the high efficiency, low emissions coal-fired power generation technology. Not just looking at the technical development, so they're very impressive, but also picking up on some of the policy challenges. I've got two slides before I get into that, as I'm conscious with my discussions with several people this morning that not everyone is familiar with the IEA Clean Coal Centre. We're what is called an Energy Technology Cooperation Programme, and it's endorsed by the International Energy Agency in Paris. And what we do is provide a means for international cooperation on clean coal related issues, and we provide objective and independent information on all aspects of the efficient and sustainable use of coal. So we look at how to use coal more effectively, more efficiently and cleanly. We look at how you can best minimize its environmental impact while providing cost-effective energy. That includes the impact of coal-related policies and regulations, because ultimately that drives what's going to happen. We look at the technologies themselves, how you can go from the research stage through to effective deployment, look at all aspects of emissions control technologies and the global coal markets. In terms of what we actually produce, our output includes comprehensive techno and economic assessment reports on all aspects of clean coal technology. We run a live monthly webinar, which is based primarily on one or other of our assessment reports, which gives the opportunity for live discussion with the people who are listening in, or watching rather. We run 3 or 4 technical workshops on clean coal issues every year. We run a more general clean coal technologies conference every other year, and we're building up our web-based dissemination services. The other point I'd like to highlight actually is increasingly we are implementing various capacity building activities in developing countries and in industrializing nations, and we're doing that to support knowledge transfer on a wide range of coal-related energy and environmental issues, particularly for power generation. This is the scope of my presentation. A bit about rhetoric and reality, then a certain amount about the information in terms of where coal remains king and probably will do so. A bit more about HELE technologies in terms of the advantages, policy regulation and funding as I've mentioned before, with a bit of a focus on China, and then a very brief word at the end on the future importance of CCS to complement the technology. So, rhetoric or reality? Several people have mentioned COP21. For those of you who weren't there, which actually includes me, there was no formal sessions at COP21 on any aspect of fossil fuels. So it tells you how that body of organisations felt about coal, and I think to actually exclude it and just focus on so-called clean energy was rather a retrograde step. There are various aspirations that people have put forward. I've got one here. I quoted it verbatim from Greenpeace. We see a different future, as in a different future from fossil fuels, one that is built on clean renewable energy. Excellent. We believe the 100% renewable energy future is not only within reach, it's our best chance for us to preserve the planet. I don't wish to be a killjoy, but this is currently technically unachievable and looks like it will be for some time, leaving aside the remarks made earlier about the fact that it may take 50 years. This is going to take longer than 50 years to achieve that sort of theory. But it's put forward as a reasonable suggestion. It's just rhetoric. The International Energy makes projections, and they made the point that even if adequate measures are put in place to meet the 2-degree scenario, and that those measures are implemented comprehensively, fossil fuels will still provide over 40% of the global energy mix. So as Benjamin and others have said, it's not going away. We've had various actions. We've had the various multilateral and OECD banks who've stated that they're going to not provide financing for new coal-fired power projects And they're going to restrict financial support to countries that have no feasible alternatives to coal. That was the World Bank. I think you need to be very careful of what you wish for. All that's going to do for countries that are determined to use coal is drive them to other lenders, of which there are still many around, but more expensive, which means they could end up, these countries, limiting the amount of money that should be spent on the overall emissions control. If you're lending the money, you can set the agenda. I think the approach by the World Bank and others is misguided at best. On the other hand, there is the promotion of high-efficiency coal-fired plants as a realistic and pragmatic and effective approach to cope with the issue of climate change, and that's a statement by the Japanese Investment Bank. And I truly believe that the way forward here is a certain level of pragmatism in terms of the fact that coal is a key part of the overall global energy mix and is going to remain so for some time. This is the classic energy trilemma. Called that because you're trying to make all three of these balance and work, and it's a difficult job. Now, coal meets two of these completely in terms of energy security and economic competitiveness. Coal is your fuel. But I would be the first to admit that there's still some way to go in certain parts, but not all parts of the world, to ensure there's an adequate environment and positive environmental impact. This slide is some work we did at the centre, which was looking at the situation in terms of new and intended power capacity from about now through till 2030. It's based on the Platts database, and it's showing the three regions. It's showing Asia. In the middle it's got the USA, and the bottom below that it's got Europe. And you can see here that Asia, which is, I think already we've heard, is a focus for the world's energy markets, especially in the developing countries in those markets, and that coal has a far greater share of gas in the power sector and looks like it's going to continue to do so. This orange part of this curve is the new coal-fired plant that is either under construction or on a firm planning basis. Above that, there is evidence that there's going to continue to be less, but still a significant amount of hydro being introduced in Asia. Then there's light blue, which shows gas, and beyond that, nuclear. The stuff at the top is solar and wind, which, though significant in absolute terms, in relative terms to these other fuels, is a thin line at the top. And that seems to be the way, whatever the rhetoric, that coal use is continuing to grow very much in Asia for all the right reasons that we've heard about. If you look at the USA, you get a very different picture. The USA has been blessed, we hear, with shale oil, and one of the side products of shale oil is shale gas. And it's certainly transformed the USA's energy mix, as a consequence of which coal use has declined significantly, but it still remains the second largest coal user in the world, and all the indications are that that will continue to do so. And again, you can see on the curve here that there's really no new coal plants planned through to 2030, but a significant amount of gas and a rather lesser amount of hydro being expected to be introduced into the power grid in the USA. Whether that's going to actually now happen must be an interesting question. Wasn't that long ago that oil prices were $100 a barrel, and you have to remember that shale oil production is very high-cost production. And with the policies being pushed by Saudi Arabia to discourage shale oil production in the USA, it's certainly having a significant effect. Whether it will be terminal, I rather doubt it, but it's certainly not going to be all the way for shale oil. That could mean a return for coal, or it could mean a return for oil and gas imports. It remains to be seen. If you look at the European Commission, you get a different picture again. And that's policy driven, because the European Commission has set a very low CO2 agenda, and that's based on a mixture of renewables and energy efficiency with gas as a backup. But there still intends to be coal built. You can see that in the graph, as well as obviously a certain predominance on wind in this instance and natural gas. The HELE technology that we've been hearing about is available now. It's being deployed commercially, particularly in Germany, India, Japan, Korea, USA, but most especially China. At the moment, you can achieve cycle efficiencies on the best plants of a little bit in excess of 46% on a low heating value basis, a net efficiency of just over 46%. And there's significant development work around the world, particularly in Japan and China at present, and to an extent in the USA, to advance the technologies to give you over 50% cycle efficiency. If you can achieve that, that in itself is going to lower the carbon intensity by a very large amount indeed. There's also other major transformational technology development programs underway to actually address the limitations of existing systems. Many programs of in this regard are being championed by the USA, very commendable too, and it's hopeful to see these programs are going to move forward. This is just a few pictures to break the words up a little. The plant on the top left-hand corner is at Asogo, a supercritical power plant in Tokyo Bay. This is very nicely designed to minimize its visual impact. I should point out that the stack that you can see on here hasn't been distorted by my photography. That's actually an elliptical stack which was put there to yet still further minimize the impact this was having on an area of great beauty within Tokyo. The plant to the right of that is Waigaoqiao number 3, which is an ultra supercritical power plant in Shanghai, and that's the flagship plant for what's going on in China, and that's very much leading the way in terms of improvements. And then there's the Mundra power plant in Gujarat, which is currently subcritical, but they are planning the addition of a number of supercritical units to this one. That's all good stuff. This is a little more detail on world deployment of ultra supercritical plant. Japan introduced this initially back in 1993, and up to 2005 it was about the only country that was starting to build these units. But then with some major policy changes in China, which introduced advanced coal power systems, very much ultra supercritical power plant took off, and you can see these light blue areas which represent year-on-year increases in ultra supercritical plant in that country. But you can also see on the legend on the right-hand side, there's quite a number of other countries which is even now growing to introduce ultra supercritical power plant. Just to put that in context, China has about 205 gigawatts of ultra supercritical plant, or certainly will have by the end of 2017. In terms of how you might implement HELE technology, there's a number it can be done through policy and regulation and with financial support if necessary. You can tighten your ambient air quality standards, which then puts the pressure on the power plants to release less emissions. You can actually introduce very strict emissions performance standards on individual plants. You can equally introduce efficiency performance standards in terms of how much coal you use to produce a kilowatt of power, which is again is a further driving approach to make the plant overall more efficient. You link that with very strong monitoring and verification, so that there's carrots to encourage you to do it, but there's quite a big stick if you don't. And if necessary, you can provide financial support, which may be needed in some of the smaller developing and industrial countries to introduce this technology. Just to give you an example of that, this is the emission standards that were brought in at the beginning of 2012, at the end of 2012 in China. Very strict standards on particulates, SO2 and NOx. And unless the plant is on a closure list, almost all of their coal-fired plants can now meet these standards. And they're also starting to now look at the issue of mercury and its related compounds, with the expectation to tighten that still further. In terms of design standards, it's a requirement that since 2006, all new coal plants, except for CHP and circulating fluidized bed systems, but all standard new coal power plants have to be supercritical or ultra supercritical and at least 600 megawatt capacity. From 2015, that was tightened further. They've got to be at least 600 megawatts, and they've got to be ultra supercritical, and it needs a good reason why it shouldn't be a 1,000 megawatt unit. And they've put in place net coal consumptions, which is shown here. Basically, it's got to be below 282 standard grams of coal equivalent per kilowatt hour of power produced. And then they're looking to take that further on the overall fleet by 2020. So there's some very tough factors come into play that's pushing the whole system to yet more advanced technology. The eastern region of the country is the most developed one. That has very problems with air quality, though it's primarily not due to the coal power plants. But even so, it's got to now meet the coal plant has to meet the emission limits for a natural gas-fired combined cycle plant. And as I said there, that is achievable and is being achieved day by day. We've also looked in detail at other countries within the Asian region about the benefits you could achieve in terms of reducing carbon emissions by moving away from subcritical towards ultra-supercritical plant. We've shown here a total for 10 of the major countries in Asia, and then more detail on China and India, and the benefits can be very significant. In terms of the way forward, as all the speakers have said, coal extraction and utilisation is set to continue and probably in overall terms expand over the next 2 decades. As we've heard, there's an ever-growing need in overall terms for energy, increased energy use, but coal has an important role to be included in that mix, but it's ultimately got to be a low-carbon future for coal, and the introduction of HELI technology is one, but I would stress one important step down that road. Coal focus currently is going to be in China, India, and the rest of Asia, and that's been reflected in much of the R&D now being taken forward by OECD countries in collaboration with partners in these sort of countries. And while I think China is certainly taking very significant steps to meet these, and is the market leader in every respect, I think there is considerable scope, to be frank, to do better in many of the other Asian countries. And to do that, you need to create the right conditions to enable that sorts of technologies to be introduced. I think also that right now the need is to incentivize best practice with HELI technologies rather than just focus on CCS, which for a number of reasons, which we haven't got time to talk about here, is not progressing anywhere near as fast as it needs to. I think also ultimately a lot of what this comes down to is knowledge transfer, and that's going to remain increasingly important, and I believe that our Clean Coal Centre can fulfill a key role in disseminating both technical, policy and regulatory information on a global basis.